Memphis, Tennessee. Summer of 1964. Elvis Presley is standing on the front porch of Graceland with a young man named Jerry Schilling, who has been his friend for 10 years and has never worked for him. It is the middle of the night. The rest of the house is quiet. Vernon Presley has gone upstairs. They are alone. Elvis says, "I need you to come work for me." Jerry says, "When?" Elvis says, "Now." Jerry Schilling thought about it for about 10 seconds. He said, "Well, can I go home and get some clothes?" Elvis said, "Sure." The next morning, Jerry Schilling quit 2 jobs. He told the university he was not going to finish his last semester and become a history teacher. He told his father, a man who had only completed grade school and was deeply proud that his son had made it this far in education, that he was leaving college to work for Elvis Presley. And then he walked through the gates of Graceland and did not look back. He was with Elvis on and off for the next 11 years. He was there for the Hollywood years, the Las Vegas comeback, the Nixon meeting, the decline. He was a pallbearer at Elvis's funeral in August of 1977. When Elvis died, Jerry Schilling did not give interviews for 2 years. He said, "It was too hard in the beginning." He was the last holdout of the Memphis Mafia to write a book about his friend. He waited because he wanted to do it right, to write about the person, not the legend. When he finally wrote it, Priscilla Presley called it authentic, honest, and truly moving. Lisa Marie Presley called it her favorite Elvis book. Bono said, "Jerry Schilling brings grace to Graceland." Peter Guralnick, the most rigorous Elvis biographer alive, praised it for its emotional honesty. This is the story Jerry Schilling waited 30 years to tell. The story of Jerry Schilling and Elvis Presley begins 10 years before that front porch. On a Sunday afternoon in July of 1954, in a touch football game on a vacant lot in North Memphis. Jerry was 12 years old. His mother had died when he was a baby. He had been raised by his grandparents, moving in with his father at 12, a shy kid with simple dreams. He wanted to go to Humes High School and maybe become a football coach. He had been listening to Dewey Phillips on the radio play rhythm and blues since he was 10, and that music had given him something that nothing else in his childhood quite provided. The sense that there was a larger world somewhere that he might one day reach. The touch football game happened the way things happened in Memphis in 1954. Somebody needed another player. Jerry wandered in off the street. The guy calling the plays was a 19-year-old with a neat greased pompadour and ducktails, wearing blue jeans and a white t-shirt and, in Jerry's words, a little smile. "That was the coolest attitude without trying to have an attitude," Schilling said decades later. From Roy Rogers to Marlon Brando, "I was trying to be like anybody who was anything all my life." And there it was. He did not know, at that moment, that the guy calling the plays had just released his first record on Sun Records. A song called "That's All Right" had debuted on Dewey Phillips's show that week. The same Dewey Phillips Jerry had been listening to for 2 years. The same music that had been giving him the sense of a larger world. The quarterback of that Sunday afternoon football game was Elvis Presley. They became friends that day. They stayed friends for 23 years. For the next 10 years, the years in which Elvis Presley became the most famous person in the world, Jerry Schilling and Elvis remained friends, but Jerry did not work for him. This is the detail that made Jerry Schilling different from every other member of the Memphis Mafia. Most of the men in Elvis's circle had been pulled in early and had built their entire lives around being near him. Their identities became inseparable from the circle. Their loyalty was expressed through proximity, through never leaving the room. What Jerry Schilling did instead was maintain a life outside. He went to college. He worked jobs. He had a career of his own that he was building. When Elvis called him to come out to Graceland, he came. When he needed to be elsewhere, he was elsewhere. This was not a calculated strategy. It was simply who Jerry was. But what it produced, almost by accident, was the specific quality that Elvis would eventually say he needed. Someone who had not been so absorbed into the orbit that they had lost the ability to see it clearly. Elvis had, by the time he asked Jerry to come work for him in 1964, surrounded himself with people who did not tell him the truth. Not out of malice, out of love, mostly. The circle of men around him, the Memphis Mafia, had grown up with him or been brought in close and had come to understand, consciously or not, that their presence in the circle depended on Elvis remaining comfortable. That comfort was purchased, frequently, with agreement, with yes. Jerry Schilling was the no. George Klein, who had known Elvis since high school at Humes and was one of his oldest friends, described what this meant. "Jerry has an insight a lot of people don't have. He was one of the few guys who would tell Elvis the truth. I think he has a different angle because he had a lot of quality time with Elvis, and Elvis respected his opinion on a lot of stuff. If this is the kind of story this channel tells, the real human being behind the icon, please subscribe. What Jerry Schilling discovered when he began working for Elvis in 1964 was a life that was almost impossible to describe to someone who had not lived inside it. Elvis Presley did not live in a house. He lived in a world, a complete, self-contained world in which the ordinary mechanics of daily existence had been entirely removed. Someone drove for him. Someone cooked. Someone organized, managed, scheduled, protected. The Memphis Mafia traveled everywhere with him, slept in rooms next to his, attended every film set, every recording session. When Elvis was in Bel Air, the entire group was in Bel Air. When he was in Las Vegas, they were in Las Vegas. When he was at Graceland, they were at Graceland. Jerry Schilling found himself living full-time in Elvis's Bel Air mansion. He describes this in his memoir with the honest bewilderment of someone who had grown up with modest dreams. Dreams of Hume's high school and coaching football, finding himself in a house that belonged to the most famous human being on earth, being paid to be his friend. What he also found was that Elvis was, underneath everything, exactly the person he had met on that football field in 1954. Jerry Schilling writes in his memoir that when he was quarterbacked by Elvis at that first football game, he made his first impression. Elvis made me feel comfortable. That was my first impression. Over the years, I got to meet and work with a lot of well-known entertainers and actors. Elvis was the only one without credentials. He just had a presence. That presence was still there in Bel Air in 1964, in the Graceland Games Room at 2 in the morning. In every recording studio and film set Jerry would observe over the next 11 years. The king of rock and roll was also, always, and in every room, the guy who had been quarterbacking a touch football game in North Memphis when he was 19 years old. Jerry Schilling never forgot the football field. That made him different from the men who had never seen it. What Jerry Schilling saw during the Hollywood years, the decade of formula films from 1960 to 1970, was not what the newspapers reported. The newspapers reported box office numbers. They reported hit singles from film soundtracks. They reported that Elvis Presley was one of the most commercially successful entertainers in the world, and that his films drew audiences, and his records sold, and that Colonel Parker had built a machine that delivered consistent returns. What Jerry Schilling witnessed from inside the house was what that machine was doing to the man inside it. Elvis Presley had wanted, from the beginning of his film career, to be a serious actor, not a singer who made movies, an actor. He had seen what Marlon Brando did on a screen and understood it as a form of expression that he wanted to pursue with the same seriousness that he brought to music. The early roles, Love Me Tender, King Creole, Jailhouse Rock, had given him reason to believe this was possible. The critics had noticed. There was something real happening. Then Colonel Parker made the deal with the studios, and the formula took hold. Film after film after film. Musical comedies with identical story structures, girls in bikinis, a handful of songs written to order, box office numbers that justified doing it again. 31 films in 11 years. Elvis said in private what he could not say in public, that he was creatively suffocating. That the movies were beneath him. That he was being used as a product, not trusted as a performer. Jerry Schilling was there. He watched Elvis read scripts he hated and make movies he did not believe in. He watched the man who had stood on a Memphis stage in 1956 and changed the direction of American music sign his films that would be forgotten within a decade. He could not stop it. He could watch it. He could be one of the few people honest enough to acknowledge what was happening. On December 21, 1970, Elvis Presley walked into the White House and met President Richard Nixon. Jerry Schilling was there. The story of what led to this meeting is one of the most genuinely strange episodes in Elvis Presley's life. And it was Jerry Schilling who made it happen. Elvis had, on December 19th, left Graceland on a commercial flight to Washington, D.C., without telling anyone where he was going. He was in a particular state of mind, agitated, purposeful, running from something or toward something or both. On the plane, he wrote a handwritten letter to President Nixon asking to meet him and proposing to be appointed a federal agent at large in the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. Elvis believed, with the specific sincerity of someone who had come to the conclusion entirely on his own, that he could help the government combat drug addiction among young people. He had a badge collection. He wanted another badge. The letter he wrote to Nixon on that flight was completely, utterly, genuinely meant. He then called Jerry Schilling, who was in Los Angeles, and told him to get to Washington. Jerry flew in. He worked the phones. He contacted Eagle Krogh at the White House. He arranged, within 24 hours, for Elvis Presley to have a meeting with the President of the United States. Jerry Schilling stands in the official White House photograph from that meeting. The famous image in which Elvis Presley, in his purple velvet suit with a gold belt, shakes hands with Richard Nixon. Sonny West is there. Jerry Schilling is there. The photograph became famous. What it shows, a man who believed with absolute sincerity that he could do something important, is exactly what Jerry had known about Elvis since the football field in 1954. Not the king, the person. The person who, at the right moment, could still surprise you. Jerry Schilling had been watching Elvis make formula movies for 6 years when the 1968 comeback special happened. He had a front row seat for what followed. The special, the NBC television broadcast filmed in June of 1968, was the moment everything changed. Jerry had been present for the weeks of preparation, for the arguments with Colonel Parker over format, for Steve Binder's insistence that Elvis be allowed to perform without the Christmas songs the network wanted. He had watched the transformation happen in real time. The black leather suit, the informal stage, the voice finally unshackled from the studio formula, released into the open air, and reminded of what it had always been. When the comeback special aired in December of 1968, it drew 42% of the television audience. The reviews were the best Elvis had received since the 1950s. And something happened inside Elvis that Jerry Schilling had been watching for years. Something that had been waiting to happen. Tom Jones, who was one of Elvis's closest friends during this period, told Jerry years later what he had told Elvis backstage at the Flamingo Hotel in April of 1968. The night his performance had lit a fire in Elvis about returning to the stage. Jerry had been watching Elvis from close range since the front porch of '64 and understood exactly what Tom Jones had seen. A man who needed permission to come back. Not from Colonel Parker, from himself. The Las Vegas comeback in the summer of 1969. The International Hotel residency, the live performance after 8 years, was what Elvis had wanted since Jerry had known him. Jerry watched him walk out on that stage and saw what had been there all along, under the formula pictures and the constrained years. The man who had been quarterbacking a touch football game in 1954, performing for no one except himself. Jerry Schilling later said about this period, "When you saw Elvis perform, truly perform, it was the most natural thing you had ever seen anyone do in their life." George Klein's description of Jerry Schilling, one of the few guys who would tell Elvis the truth, was not a compliment about a rare personality trait. It was a description of a structural fact. Inside the circle around Elvis Presley, the truth was dangerous. This requires some explanation. The Memphis Mafia was not made of cynical men. They were not flatterers for strategic reasons. They were, for the most part, genuinely devoted to Elvis. Men who had grown up around him or been brought close and had come to love him in the particular way that proximity to a transcendent talent produces. Not blind to the flaws, but willing to absorb them in exchange for the experience of being near something extraordinary. But love, structured the wrong way, becomes complicity. Elvis Presley, by the late 1960s, had a doctor who prescribed him whatever he asked for. He had a circle of men whose continued presence at Graceland depended on his good mood. He had a manager who had built a business model around keeping him comfortable and commercially productive. And he had, as a result, very few people who would walk into the room and say the thing that needed to be said. Jerry Schilling said it, not always, not perfectly, but more than anyone else. He describes in his memoir specific moments of trying to speak the truth to Elvis about the pills, about the declining health, about the things that needed to change. He describes what it was like to be one of the few people in a circle of people who could not say no, who could still say no. And he describes what happened when the truth was received. Sometimes it was heard. Sometimes the conversation continued. Sometimes Elvis would look at him for a long moment, not respond, and then change the subject. But Jerry kept saying it, because that was who he was, and because Elvis kept calling him back, specifically because he was the person who would. The thing Jerry Schilling writes about most consistently, the thing that comes through every interview he gives and every page of his memoir, is not the fame, not the decline, not the dysfunction. It is the generosity. Elvis Presley paid for Jerry Schilling's home in West Hollywood Hills. This is documented. He did not make an announcement about it. He did not negotiate a repayment plan. He heard that Jerry needed a house and he bought him one. This was not unusual. It was, in the context of Elvis's life, the way things worked. He bought cars for strangers in dealership parking lots. He paid medical bills for people he barely knew. He hosted people at Graceland at his own expense for weeks or months, asking nothing in return. He funded charities at Christmas, anonymously, consistently, in amounts that the public did not know about until years after his death. What Jerry Schilling understood about this generosity, and what the public version of Elvis's story frequently misses, was that it was not performance. It was not publicity. It was not even, primarily, an expression of the Southern tradition of hospitality, though it was that too. It was Elvis trying to do something real in a life that had become very difficult to make real. Everything else was managed. The performances were managed. The image was managed. The recording sessions were managed. The tour schedule was managed. The only thing that Elvis could do entirely of his own volition, without Colonel Parker's approval, and without the machinery of the entertainment business having a view on it, was give something away. When he bought Jerry Schilling a house, he was not being generous. He was being free. Jerry understood this. He writes about it in the memoir, with the specific honesty of someone who received the gift and understood what it meant, not just as a transaction, but as an act of freedom by a man who had very few of them. By the mid-1970s, Jerry Schilling had watched Elvis Presley for more than 20 years. He had been present for the football field and the front porch and the White House and the comeback. He had seen Elvis at his most free and his most constrained. What he saw in the mid to late 1970s was different from all of it. The prescription medication had been part of Elvis's life since the Army, since the early 1960s when the demands of the touring schedule and the Las Vegas residency schedule had made sleep something that required pharmaceutical assistance. By the mid-70s, the pharmacology had expanded far beyond sleep. Dr. George Nicopolis, Dr. Nick, the family physician who would eventually be investigated for the prescriptions he wrote, had become the central figure of Elvis's medical care. And the prescriptions had become, in Jerry Schilling's account, and in the accounts of everyone else close to Elvis during this period, a crisis that nobody inside the circle had the power to fully address. Jerry Schilling tried. The memoir makes this clear. He raised the subject. He said what needed to be said. He was heard sometimes. He was not heard enough. The Las Vegas years wore Elvis down in ways that the residency schedules show plainly in retrospect. The number of performances, the demands, the weight gain, the deteriorating health. Jerry watched Elvis perform in shows where Elvis was not fully present, where the voice was still there, as it always was, but where the man was somewhere else. He watched it because he could not stop watching. Elvis was his oldest friend. The football field in North Memphis was still there, somewhere underneath everything. And Jerry Schilling had never been the kind of person who looked away from what was real. In 1976, Jerry Schilling left the employment of Elvis Presley to manage the career of the Beach Boys. He remained Elvis's friend. He was still in contact. He was present for the final tour. Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977. He was 42 years old. Jerry Schilling was called to Memphis. The accounts of what the final months had looked like, the late period tours, the last concerts, the condition Elvis was in at the end, are documented in multiple sources and are consistent in their outlines. The summer of 1977 had been a difficult one. The tour scheduled to begin on August 17th would have been one of the most demanding of the Las Vegas years. Elvis had been at Graceland. What Jerry Schilling had known, for years, that most of the public had not, was that the situation had been serious for a long time. He had watched it develop. He had said what could be said. The machinery of the system around Elvis, the management, the medical care, the circle of yes, had not been dismantled in time. Jerry Schilling was a pallbearer at Elvis Presley's funeral. He helped carry the casket. He then did not give interviews for 2 years. He said years later, "It was too hard in the beginning. He was always there for me. After he passed, it was very important to me to continue on with my life, as difficult as that was." He continued with his life. He managed the Beach Boys. He managed Jerry Lee Lewis. He managed the career of Lisa Marie Presley, who called Jerry one of the few people who remained in her life from that time. He worked for Elvis Presley Enterprises as creative affairs director. He produced documentaries about Elvis. He worked at keeping the memory of his friend alive in the way he knew best. Through the work, through the documentation, through the record of what had actually happened. And then, in 2006, he wrote the book. Jerry Schilling was the last holdout of the Memphis Mafia to write a book about Elvis Presley. By the time Me and a Guy Named Elvis was published in 2006, the body of literature about Elvis was substantial. Red West and Dave Hebler and Sonny West had published Elvis. What Happened in 1977, the explosive tell-all that had appeared 2 weeks before Elvis's death. Joe Esposito had written. Lamar Fike had talked to Albert Goldman for a controversial biography. Charlie Hodge had written. Almost everyone who had been inside the circle had, at some point, written about it. Jerry waited. He waited because he did not want to write a book about himself. He wanted to write about the person. He wanted the human side, the side that the iconic image, enormous and permanent as it was, consistently obscured. He said, "I really felt I knew that side, and I was very fortunate to experience it. I realized about 3 years ago that I had a book that would be a good historical record of Elvis as a human being. The people who knew Elvis and had also read the book said it was the most honest account of the man they had encountered. Priscilla Presley called it authentic, honest, and truly moving. Lisa Marie Presley said the book captured the beauty of her father's spirit in a way that had never been done before, that it was by far her favorite Elvis book. Peter Guralnick, whose 2-volume biography is considered the most rigorous Elvis scholarship in existence, praised its emotional honesty. Bono wrote, Jerry Schilling brings grace to Graceland. What they were recognizing was the same thing George Klein had always seen in Jerry Schilling. He had the keys to the kingdom. He told the truth. He waited until he could tell it properly. The football field was still there in every page. The story of Jerry Schilling and Elvis Presley is, at its most basic, a story about what it means to tell someone the truth. Elvis Presley was surrounded, for most of his adult life, by people who loved him and could not say no to him. This was not a conspiracy. It was not malicious. It was the natural product of proximity to someone extraordinary, the specific human tendency to protect the thing you love by agreeing with it, by not disturbing the peace, by absorbing the problems rather than naming them. Jerry Schilling was different because his life was different. He had come in from outside. He had maintained his own career. He had never fully dissolved into the circle. And because of that, he retained the thing that the circle needed and could not produce for itself: a clear view of what was actually happening. George Klein said it plainly. He was one of the few guys who would tell Elvis the truth. Elvis respected his opinion on a lot of stuff. What Jerry Schilling saw from that position, from the front porch in 1964 to the pallbearer walk in 1977, was the full arc of Elvis Presley's life as it was actually lived. Not the legend, not the icon. The person who had been quarterbacking a touch football game in North Memphis when he was 19 years old, and who never entirely lost that quality. The ease, the presence, the specific warmth that made a 12-year-old boy walk over and not want to leave. Jerry Schilling waited 30 years to write the book. He waited because he wanted to do it right. When he finally wrote it, Priscilla Presley said, he had the keys to the kingdom. He unlocks every door. Lisa Marie Presley said, it is by far my favorite. Peter Guralnick, the most rigorous Elvis scholar alive, said what distinguishes the book most of all is its emotional honesty. And Bono said simply, Jerry Schilling brings grace to Graceland. He brings it because he earned it. Because he told the truth when nobody else could. Because he carried his friend's casket and then went on living, as difficult as that was. Because on a Sunday afternoon in 1954, a 12-year-old boy wandered into a football game and discovered something he spent the rest of his life trying to do justice to. The truth about Elvis Presley is not in the concert footage, or the jumpsuits, or the gold records. It is in the people who knew him when he was nobody, and stayed when he was everything, and kept his memory honest after he was gone. If this is the kind of Elvis history you want to keep watching, subscribe to the channel. There are more moments, more people, and more untold stories still to document. And if Jerry Schilling's story moved you, if you have ever been the person in someone's life who told them the truth when everyone else said yes, leave it in the comments. This community was built for exactly that kind of conversation.